The room was dim except for the harsh glow of a monitor, and I remember the cold sting of the oxygen tube against my cheek as I drifted somewhere between sleep and pain. Then I heard it. My own daughter's voice, low and certain, urging the doctor to let me go. For a moment, the air felt too heavy to breathe, as if the walls themselves were closing around me. If you've ever trusted someone so completely that the truth almost broke you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes the people closest to us carry the sharpest edges. I forced my eyes open that day, not because I felt strong, but because something inside me refused to disappear quietly. I didn't know it then, but that was only the first fracture. Let me show you how everything fell apart. I can still hear it, the low, urgent tone of my daughter, insisting that the doctor stop trying to save me. That memory slammed into me the moment I opened my eyes in the hospital, hovering somewhere between sleep and consciousness, unsure if I had imagined it or if it was the truth I never wanted to face. As the room slowly sharpened around me, the weight of that realization settled in my chest. I'm 68 years old, and I never thought I'd wake up questioning whether my own child wanted me to take my last breath without a fight. Lying there, I felt a strange mix of confusion and dread, as if my mind was trying to protect me from a truth too heavy to hold all at once. I kept replaying that moment, searching for an explanation that didn't involve betrayal, but every instinct in me whispered the same answer. Something had shifted long before I found myself in that bed. I tried to breathe through the sting of it, grounding myself in the simple fact that I was still alive. But survival came with its own burden, understanding how things had spiraled to this point. And as I lay there, I knew this story didn't start in that hospital room. Before everything unraveled, my life was quiet in a way I had grown to cherish. I lived in the same modest house my husband and I bought decades ago, a place filled with small reminders of a marriage built on steadiness and mutual respect. We worked hard, saved carefully, and planned for a future where I could age with dignity. After he passed, those savings were what allowed me to stay afloat, even in the lonely years that followed. When my daughter Lauren returned home after her divorce, I opened the door without hesitation. I remember telling myself that a soft place to land might help her find her footing again. At first, having her close brought a touch of warmth back into the house. But gradually, I noticed how her spending grew careless, how her frustrations simmered just beneath the surface. I kept making excuses for her, convincing myself she simply needed time to recover. A mother's heart can blur the harshest truths. Looking back, I see how often I stepped in to cover a bill or smooth over a mistake, thinking I was helping her rebuild. In reality, I was enabling habits I didn't want to acknowledge. Small cracks began to show, little comments that stung more than they should have, moments when her eyes lingered on the details of my finances. I didn't understand it then, but those were the first ripples of a much larger storm, one that began the moment she brought someone new into her life. Brandon Pierce entered my life on a quiet afternoon, walking into my home with a kind of polished confidence that felt practiced rather than natural. He had the sort of charm that seemed ready-made for first impressions, steady eye contact, an easy smile, and a way of speaking that made everything sound intentional. Lauren stood beside him, beaming, so eager for me to like him that I felt pressured to ignore the small knot forming in my stomach. As I watched him move around the room, I found myself studying him more than I normally would. There was something too smooth about the way he complimented everything, as if he had memorized a script on how to win people over. And every now and then, his attention drifted toward my belongings, my framed photos, the small details of my home, the subtle signs of the life I had built. When he casually steered our conversations toward finances, it came cloaked in concern, framed as a thoughtful interest in my comfort and long-term security. But there was an eagerness beneath it that didn't belong there. Still, I tried to steady my thoughts. Lauren hadn't looked this hopeful in years, and a part of me wanted to believe she had finally met someone kind. I told myself I was being overly protective, that grief and age had made me suspicious. But even as I tried to quiet my instincts, a quiet unease began to settle in. Something about him didn't feel right. That feeling wouldn't leave me, and it eventually pushed me to look deeper into who he really was. When Rita Coleman handed me the results of her investigation, I felt the air leave my lungs before I even looked at a single page. There was a weight to the folder, a quiet promise that whatever lived inside it would divide my life into before and after. And it did. Brandon wasn't just a smooth talker with questionable manners. He was a career scammer, a man who drifted from vulnerable households to lonely retirees, leaving behind drained accounts and broken families. His record stretched back years, a pattern so deliberate it made my skin crawl. But the part that shattered me, the part that hollowed out something inside me, was learning that Lauren had been involved long before she brought him through my front door. Rita traced financial documents, social media messages, and a trail of transactions that painted a picture I didn't want to see. My daughter wasn't a victim. She was a partner. She knew exactly who he was and what he did. And together, they had been preparing to target me. I remember sitting alone after reading everything, trying to understand how her heart had drifted so far from mine. I kept replaying the past year. Every moment I thought I was helping her rebuild, realizing she'd been laying the groundwork for something far darker. The heartbreak washed over me in waves, first disbelief, then sorrow, then a numb clarity. That was the moment I understood I couldn't confront them. Not yet. If I showed my cards, they'd accelerate whatever plan they had left. So I made a choice. I would stay quiet. I would pretend to be the trusting mother they expected. And I would start gathering evidence of my own, because the danger was only beginning. I had to become someone they believed they could manage, slightly forgetful, a little overwhelmed, but still grateful for their help. It felt strange to dim my own light on purpose, but playing along was the only way to stay ahead of them. Brandon leaned into this version of me with a practiced gentleness, offering suggestions about simplifying my finances or letting him handle certain decisions. He framed it as concern, as if he were simply looking out for an aging woman who might be losing her grip. Lauren echoed him. Her voice always dipped in exaggerated worry, reminding me of things I hadn't forgotten and questioning decisions I hadn't misjudged. Inside, I stayed steady. I began documenting everything. Quiet notes, little recordings tucked away, dates written in a small notebook they never saw. Their visits became more frequent, each one laced with subtle tests meant to gauge how much control they had gained. I recognized the pattern undermine my confidence, then step in as the guiding hands. The turning point came one evening when I heard their voices through the cracked patio door. They spoke in low, urgent tones, unaware I was close enough to catch the shape of their plans. They intended to have me declared mentally incompetent, to take over my accounts legally, to isolate me so thoroughly that no one would question it. Hearing my own daughter strategize against me felt like the floor opening beneath my feet, but once the shock burned off, a calm resolve settled in. I knew then that pretending was no longer just strategy, it was survival. And as they mentioned scheduling a medical evaluation to prove their case, I realized exactly where their plan would strike next. The ambush was already in motion. They told me it was just a routine checkup, something the clinic wanted to update in my file, and for a moment I let myself pretend that was true. But the instant I stepped inside, I felt the shift in the air. The waiting room was too quiet, the staff too still, and the doctor who greeted us had a tone that sounded rehearsed, as if he already knew what story he was supposed to support. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression soft, reminding myself that panic would only feed their script. As I sat down across from him, the questions he asked were crafted to make me stumble. They weren't meant to evaluate, they were meant to confuse. Every time I tried to answer, Lauren cut in with gentle exaggerations about my forgetfulness, and Brandon hovered behind me, adding subtle comments that made me sound fragile, disoriented, incapable. I could feel the walls closing in, the doctor nodding along as if the verdict had already been written. Inside, I fought to stay calm. I focused on my breathing, on the details I could control, on keeping my mind sharp even as they tried to twist every answer into something it wasn't. But when the doctor shifted his papers and I caught a glimpse of the incompetency form beneath them, the truth settled cold in my chest. They weren't just probing, they were ready to file. Lauren's voice tightened with urgency. Brandon's posture sharpened, and suddenly the room felt smaller, heavier. When I resisted signing anything, I saw the panic flicker across Brandon's face. He stepped closer, too close, his frustration curdling into something darker. The last thing I remember is the blur of his movement, the sudden force against my temple, and the sound of the chair scraping the floor as my world tilted away from me. Then everything went dark. When consciousness finally drifted back to me, it came in fragments, light pressing against my eyelids, the distant hum of machines, a throbbing along the side of my skull that pulsed with each breath. For a moment, I didn't know where I was or why everything inside me felt heavy and unmoored. Then memory seeped in like cold water, the clinic, the papers, Brandon's looming anger, the sudden blow that sent my world spiraling into blackness. I tried to shift, and pain rushed across my temple, sharp enough to make my vision blur. As I steadied myself, I heard Lauren's voice nearby, soft and coated with worry. But something about it felt staged. Her concern didn't land the way genuine fear does. It floated on the surface, thin and performative. I kept my eyes closed, listening, letting instinct guide me. That was when I heard her speak to someone just outside my room, her tone hushed but laced with urgency. She talked about how my injury might prove what they needed, how the doctor at the clinic had seen enough to support their claims, how they just had to move quickly before I got confused again. Each word cut deeper than the pain in my head. In that moment, grief settled into something sturdier. I realized they weren't finished. They planned to use this, my injury, my vulnerability, to push the incompetency filing as soon as possible. But they didn't know I was listening, and they definitely didn't know I was done being passive. When she finally stepped away, I reached for the phone beside the bed. My hands trembled, but my resolve did not. I called Rita first, then Agent Dana Ross, explaining just enough for them to understand the urgency. The next steps had to be careful, and they had to be mine. I knew I had only a small window before Lauren tried to turn my injury into a legal weapon, so I forced myself upright and steadied the room until it stopped tilting. Every step hurt, but the fear of staying hurt more. I moved quietly, keeping my head down as I slipped past the nurse's station, feeling the stiff pull of bandages along my temple. The elevator ride felt endless, and when the doors finally opened to the lobby, I walked out with the calmest face I could manage, even as adrenaline thudded through my chest. Outside, the air felt sharp and too bright. I reached into my purse and felt the recorder buried beneath my wallet. That small device suddenly felt heavier than anything I owned. packed with the proof they never intended for me to survive long enough to use. I called Rita as soon as I reached the parking lot. Hearing her steady confidence through the haze in my mind, she understood immediately. She gathered the files, the screenshots, the bank statements, everything she had uncovered. Then I contacted Agent Dana Ross. Her measured clarity cut straight through the panic tightening my ribs. She laid out the steps, the protections, the urgency. As I listened, something inside me shifted. I was no longer the one running. I was preparing the line they would cross without realizing it. When I finally reached Rita's office, we spread everything across her desk, seeing it all, months of lies, transactions, recordings, plans, made the truth undeniable. They had built a trap for me, but they left footprints everywhere. And for the first time, I felt the momentum turn. Soon enough, Lauren would understand she was no longer steering this story. I spotted them the moment I stepped out of the elevator. Lauren, flanked by two men I didn't recognize, standing outside my hotel room door. The sight of her pressing her ear to the frame sent a cold wave through me. I watched from the corner of the hallway, barely breathing, as one of the men slid a tool into the lock. They moved with a quiet urgency, rifling through my belongings the second the door cracked open. Seeing my clothes tossed, my papers scattered, felt like watching my life being dismantled piece by piece. For a moment, fear pinned me in place. My own daughter had followed me here, ready to drag me back before I could expose them. The weight of that truth stung more than the injury still throbbing beneath my bandage. Then everything shifted. Agents came from both ends of the hallway, swift, controlled, already prepared. I watched them step in, announce themselves, and pull the three of them back into the corridor. The men went rigid. Lauren's bravado dissolved the moment the cuffs clicked around her wrists. I felt heartbreak, yes, but also a strange, quiet relief. This was the turn none of them expected, and it was only the beginning of what the courtroom would reveal next. Walking into the courtroom felt heavier than I expected, as if every step carried the weight of the past months. I sat quietly while the evidence was laid out in a steady, unbroken stream. The recordings I had gathered played back the manipulation in their own voices. Rita's findings outlined Brandon's history with calculated precision. Financial records traced every attempt to siphon what my husband and I had spent a lifetime building. Photographs from the clinic and reports from the hospital completed the picture, exposing the assault and the planned incompetency filing. I tried not to look at Lauren, but my eyes kept drifting toward her. Her expression shifted between shock and denial, as if she could not reconcile the life she had chosen with the consequences unfolding in front of her. Brandon stared straight ahead, rigid and unblinking, the mask he wore finally useless. The judge listened with a stern stillness that made the truth feel even sharper. I watched the certainty settle over the room, the realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of weakness. It was a deliberate scheme, and the law responded with a firmness that left no room for excuses. My heart hurt, of course. She was still my daughter, but sitting there, I understood that protecting myself was not betrayal, it was survival. And as the proceedings moved toward their conclusion, I felt the first flicker of peace, knowing the next chapter would be about healing, not hiding. The quiet that followed the verdict felt almost unfamiliar, like stepping into a room I once loved but hadn't visited in years. I returned to my home with a kind of reverence, touching the walls, opening the windows, and letting the lights settle into spaces that had carried so much fear. Slowly, I reclaimed my routines. I organized my finances, reconnected with neighbors, and allowed myself to breathe without waiting for the next blow. The grief came in waves, Grief for the daughter I once knew, for the future I had imagined, and for the pieces of myself I had ignored in the name of love. But acceptance followed, gentle and steady. I learned that boundaries are not walls. They are doors I choose when and how to open. And I learned that protecting my life and dignity is not selfishness. It is courage. As the days passed, I felt something stronger returning trust in my own judgment, trust in my voice, trust in the quiet peace of my own company. If my story resonates with you, if you've faced betrayal, manipulation, or the painful work of letting go, I hope you'll share your thoughts below. Your experiences matter, and you're not alone.